This series of videos is about my process for making sandbox campaigns. Having a defined process helps me stay focused on what matters most when I'm creating a sandbox. My process helps me get back on track when I get distracted, when I feel blocked or out of ideas for my current step in the process. My process is not going to be your process. There are different methods of sandbox campaign. Don't let anybody tell you that there is one and only one method. In this video, I'm going to talk about 3 methods. I've used all of them. They have different trade-offs. None of them are completely great in all areas. The one that I use, or the method that I use, works great for me. The first method is the bottom-up method. Bottom-up is the method described by Gary Gygax in the Dungeon Master's Guide for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in the section called The Campaign. I recommend reading it. I'm calling it the bottom-up method. That's not what Gary called it. It's just the term that a lot of gamers use. One version of this method commonly used by old school Renaissance guys is the Gygax 75 method. It was created or sort of derived by Ray Otis from an article that Gary Gygax wrote for a zine called Europa in 1975. You can find a link to Ray's complete write-up about it in the description. The bottom-up process is to create the area where the campaign starts and only the area where the campaign starts. There's no big world or continent maps or cultures or big religions or anything like that. It's only the stuff that's immediately important to the area where the players are going to be at. That'll be the town the players use for their home base, for their characters, a nearby dungeon, or maybe 2 or 3 at most, and the surrounding wilderness or landscape around the home base and those dungeons. The referee doesn't bother with the rest of the setting until this campaign lasts long enough to make it necessary. This method has the advantage of being fast. I can get a campaign started in a matter of weeks using a bottom-up method. The problem I find that I have with bottom-up is it requires more improvisation than other methods. Since players can go anywhere, do anything in the sandbox, there's going to be areas that I just haven't figured out. What I end up doing is I have to improvise this stuff, and I end up creating things on the fly that have some holes in them, and these things sort of build up, and they created big problems for me when the players got to high levels in the campaign. I've never found a way to avoid improvising in a role-playing game, and especially not in a sandbox. So that for me is the biggest downside, is the improv problem. One way to reduce but not get rid of improvisation is the top-down method. With top-down, I create a more detailed setting that includes histories and pantheons and cosmologies and loads of NPCs. This is sort of a world building approach, and a lot of game masters like to do this sort of thing, and it's a cool and fun hobby all by itself. And I've tried this a few times, and the cool thing is that it creates coherent, consistent setting, but it takes a long time and a lot of work to get the adventures game to the table. And some of the stuff that I produced, players just ignore. So you get, with the top-down, less need for improvisation because you've created all this stuff, but you're creating so much stuff that it takes a long time to produce, and players a lot of times don't see all of it. The next method is a hybrid method that I picked up from Alexander McChris. He combines the top-down method and the bottom-up method, and he wrote about it in his book Arbiter of Worlds. Alex recommends creating a top-down framework, but focusing on creating detail at the local and regional level. I've used this method, and I found it is a lot less work than top-down, but more work than the bottom up. And so it's kind of in between, but it has the benefit of producing a coherent setting that holds together when things get into high level without the need for massive amounts of improvisation, which and the continuity and coherent issues that can create. The order that he creates each part of the campaign is different from mine, and that sequence has some effect on how the final method or the final result. And so he creates everything in a chronological fashion from the beginning of the setting's history towards its present moment when the players start. And I do the opposite of that. I call what I do think big, build small, in reverse. So think big starts with building or designing creating a framework of the biggest structures of the campaign world. And I organize my collection of ideas from the biggest things to the smallest things, and then I work on the smallest part in detail. That's the work small. Think big, work small. And then I work in terms of history and backstory and things like that in reverse chronological order. I start by imagining the highest level that my player characters could reach. So that's, fighting ancient dragons and 30th level necromancers and traveling in the plains. I don't go into detail about that. I just imagine what the peak moments that the career of a player character could be. And then I think about what that implies. What has to exist in a setting for that to happen? Thinking about that gives me a framework for improvising and adding to the campaign as we go along. I'm not creating these things in detail. These are just sort of placeholders that I write down for things that I will create as the campaign progresses. My main focus throughout my creation process, is the point where the characters arrive on the scene in session 1. I create information about what is happening, what non-player characters, factions, monsters, and adventure locations are present in the starting area when the campaign begins. I build a rough chronological outline of what happened prior to that in reverse chronological order, and only as much details as I think players need to make decisions about where to go and what to do in the sandbox. Also create a vague and sort of malleable outcome or outline of the campaign world outside of that starting area. What this produces is a coherent campaign world like the top-down method, but the majority of the detailed world building is limited to what I need, which is more like the bottom-up method. Think big, work small, and reverse allows me to create a campaign framework that will last for years without a lot of wasted time and effort on details that players aren't going to be interested in. It is important to note that I'm creating an open-ended framework. In the first video, I talked about a long campaign built on collaborative, emergent gameplay that's driven by player objectives. When I create the campaign, I really don't know what the campaign will look like in 100 sessions later, because what I'm doing is creating a sort of model or a simulation of the world where the player characters are at, and then I'm giving the players autonomy to do what they want with what I've created. I role play the factions and the monsters and the NPCs in the setting, and I imagine what those entities are doing when they're faced with a group of rascals making a mess of the world. That way I can stay a couple of steps ahead of the players without railroading them down a specific path, still have enough information to cover the possibilities. The gameplay that emerges over time is based on what the players are interested in, and if I've run it right, it'll feel like a real dynamic world that responds to them instead of being this sort of cardboard cutout that they're sort of just passing through as tourists. A really important note about process is I'm presenting the steps in a particular order because one, this is a series of videos and it's just easier to do it that way. But I don't always follow the steps in the specific order I'm presenting them in. I try to follow them in this same order, but sometimes I bounce around. And I just use this sequence that I'm going to present as a way to organize my thoughts and keep me focused on what I'm trying to do. So now that I've talked about the sort of general outline of the process, I'll give more detail about the steps.